Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. A nation deeply divided, rapidly heading toward a civil war that will cause bloodshed across the land and cost more than 600,000 lives. Today we reveal San Antonio's role in the Civil War, how the first gunshots almost were fired at the Alamo, and how the mission-turned-military fort played a pivotal role in America's bloodiest conflict. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. Today we are joined by Dr. Don Frazier, the director of the Texas Center at Schreiner University in Kerrville, Texas. Thank you for being here.
Hey, happy to be here and honored to be asked.
Dr. Frazier, you are an award-winning author, a historian. Tell us about your background and about the Texas Center.
Well, my background's pretty simple. I was a product of the defense industry. I was working at General Dynamics and was really interested in doing something different than helping F-16s take to flight.
Which is still pretty cool.
Well, I don't know. It's way cool. I mean, you never get watching that mile-long assembly line never gets old. But I wanted to do something that I thought would have a little longer shelf life. I'd been trained as a journalist, so a newspaper guy, Fort Worth Star-Telegram, actually. Did a little Major League Baseball, still wasn't scratching the itch, but I'd always been interested in history. So after a particularly bad day at General Dynamics, I went to TCU and said, what is this graduate school thing I keep hearing about? And that's actually how I got into the business, is went to graduate school because I didn't like my job. Had a very supportive wife who made sure that, she kept all the bills paid while I was pursuing my life of the mind. So that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing. I was in the classroom for 26 years. I've taught at TCU, at McMurray, and at Schreiner, all three. So all three Texas schools, all three private schools as well. The way that I ended up in Kerrville is I got recruited in. Schreiner University in Kerrville decided that they would be the university in the state of Texas that would be keenly interested in the Texas identity. And they said, why don't you come down and help us achieve that strategic goal? In essence, it was come down and figure out what Texas needs to have its story told and how a university like Schreiner could live into that need and help Texas achieve whatever it needed to achieve in the future. What surprised everybody, especially the guys at Schreiner, was that not everybody agrees on what the Texas story is. And it is extraordinarily different depending on who you talk to. So those have been the waters that I've been navigating ever since, 2020. So we started that at the very beginning of COVID. And that gave me an opportunity to kind of kick the tires and see what was going down across the state. And there's a lot of stuff going on.
I'll say. And in 2021, the Texas governor appointed you to the 1836 Commission. What work does that commission do?
Okay, it was interesting. We had sort of parallel impulses going on. So Schreiner was thinking the same way that lawmakers over in Austin were thinking, which is Texas is adding about 1,400 people a day. And it's growing faster than any place else in the country. There's a real danger of losing that Texas story in that process. So while Schreiner was thinking about it as an academic exercise and also as a way of really participating in that K through 16 educational journey, the lawmakers in Austin said, look, we need somebody that knows something about Texas to come in there and advise us on how to tell that Texas story and how our different state agencies tell that Texas story. It seemed like a really nice symbiotic relationship. We're doing the sort of pointy-headed things on the college campus, but then down at the halls of the Capitol, there's also some work going on there, too, to make sure that Texas remains essentially Texas. I've coined the phrase cultural sustainability. You think about natural resource sustainability and things like that, sustainable energy. Well, cultures come from someplace, and they're fed by different factors. I'm now in the sort of culture feeding business, both at the state level and also at a small private school.
And on the museum level, you're also involved here at the Alamo as we make the $550 million Alamo plan a reality.
Oh, yeah. I mean, nobody tells the Texas story better than the Alamo. So the Texas story really kind of begins here and in many ways kind of ends here. I mean, this is the alpha and omega of the Texas story. So it's critical that we get it right here at the Alamo. I mean, it's critical that we get the Texas story right across the state, primarily because Texas is about to be the most important of the 50 states. So if Texas is the most important of the 50 states, and we get it right, then the nation will be better off. You see the cranes and you see the construction work going on at Alamo Plaza, and you think, man, that is so inconvenient. And this is getting in the way of my fourth grade field trip. But no, it's time. It's time to get it right. And people just need to be patient because what's going on down here is critically important.
Absolutely. Well, today we are here to talk about a very complicated chapter in our nation's history.
That's where I live most of the time.
The Civil War and how it impacted San Antonio.
Yeah.
So let's begin a few years before the war unfolded. In the 1850s, Texas is still pretty new to the United States. So set the scene for us.
Yeah, so Texas is, by any definition, a roaring frontier. It's hard to believe, but it was Nacogdoches and those parts that were the settled parts, and everything really beyond that was West Texas. And, of course, we think of West Texas in terms of, Midland, Odessa, Big Spring, Amarillo, but San Antonio was West Texas. And the people that were attracted to this very, very important town came from all over the world. Now, one of the big influences in the 1850s is the arrival of the military. San Antonio is already becoming a military city, and every nail, horseshoe, saddle, bridle that went out to the Texas frontier forts were passing through San Antonio. But it also attracted new immigrants from places like Germany. And so there is a very diverse population in San Antonio that really is tough to get your arms all the way around. So on the Civic Plaza, you have the chili queens, and they're cooking all sorts of local dishes and cuisines for all these newcomers. Then you got German being spoken, Spanish being spoken. There's probably some Polish being spoken down here, and then there's some Tennessean being spoken at the same time. So it's anybody's guess on what this town, what really lays at the foundation of this town in the 1850s. But there's a lot of different opinions.
How big was the enslaved population at this time?
It was about 1 in 10. So slavery does, in fact, cast a shadow in San Antonio in the 1850s. People moved out here and said, we can start a plantation out here of some kind. But largely, it was not plantation agriculture that influenced the enslaved population numbers in San Antonio. Is mostly domestics, body servants, butlers, people that were really handling the day-to-day household affairs of some of the people that were moving here. Although a lot of people say, well, slavery wasn't that widespread in Texas. All right, may not, 1 in 4 Texans owned slaves at the time. But more than that, aspired to own slaves because that was the route to generational wealth. So think of slave-driven agriculture in the 1850s as being sort of the oil business of the 1850s. That's where you could strike it rich and bet big and win big. And so that was always on the edge, too. As a lot of people found the, slave economy to be repulsive. Some people found it to be kind of stifling to other economic enterprises. So much of the capital that was flowing into Texas in the 1850s was supporting slavery and slave plantations and slave agriculture. And as a result, there was not as much capital to go around for things like mercantile enterprises and things like that. It's a very, very strange time in San Antonio.
How did Texas joining the United States as a slave state tip the scales for the Civil War?
Nobody knows exactly where the western boundaries of Texas are when it gets annexed. That's one of the big issues. And so it's clearly that Texas is a large enough place to compose maybe 5 different states. And if each one of these states brings in 2 senators, then the next thing you know, you've got all of the various branches of government rolling towards the slave camp. Well, the linchpin to all this is the executive branch. And as long as there is a pro-slavery president in office, then slavery will probably remain undisturbed. And that's essentially how the elites in the South, the people that were heavily invested in enslaved agriculture, enslaved labor, that's how they liked it. But there was a lot of people up north that said, look, Texas is a great example of what happens when slavery starts to expand. And slavery needs to expand in order for it to remain viable because sooner or later you have enough slaves and you don't have enough land to work all the slaves. So you have to find some place to sell them. And Texas is the place. Texas is booming as a slave economy. There are people moving their slaves here because the market here is just hot. So if you're trying to shut down slavery, somehow you've got to put a curb on it. Texas breaks through that barrier and opens up the door to perhaps expanding slavery all the way to the West Coast. It's a linchpin. I mean, Texas is where this thing is really going to be decided.
In the 1850s, in the run-up to the Civil War, were there talks in San Antonio about leaving the Union?
Well, there's always been people talking about leaving the Union. I mean, that talk starts in New England, actually, during the War of 1812. So there's a perennial American pastime called "we don't like the government, so we're going to resist." And that resist may end up looking like secession. There were people by 1860 that were never Lincolners, We're just never going to agree to anything Abraham Lincoln says. You take a look at headlines today, and they should sound very familiar to an 1850s San Antonian, Bejarreño. So in San Antonio, there is a strange blend of Germans who are absolutely anti-slavery. And they actually issue a statement saying, we don't like slavery, we don't support slavery, but then they hedge their bets. We think that slavery should be handled as a state issue and not a federal issue. Well, the folks that were trying to help slavery sink deeper roots in Texas accused them of being disloyal. And they said, hey, man, we've opened our arms to you guys. We've opened our homes. We're glad you guys moved to San Antonio. What's all this other chatter you guys are talking about? So San Antonio ends up becoming a pretty divided place. And there are, as early as 1850, there was people talking about southern states coalescing and leaving the Union. But in San Antonio, it's not a particular hotbed. In fact, San Antonians tend to enjoy their relationship with the federal government because they see federal paychecks going out from all the different government jobs that are coming into San Antonio. So.
And some of this debate took place right next door to the Alamo in the Menger Hotel.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so when secession comes upon the land and South Carolina makes the move, there are people that get together in the Menger Hotel and start talking about secession. And what's interesting about secession in Texas is that they hold a referendum. Sam Houston was not going to just assume that, secession was legal or secession happened without asking the people of Texas. So Sam Houston's not going to just let secession occur spontaneously. The question arises, how does one exactly secede from the Union? There's no precedent. There is no, there's no guidebook on, secession for dummies. And so these guys get together at the Menger Hotel and say, look, secession's happening and we're going to help make it happen. And that becomes really ground zero for secession chatter in San Antonio. And when the delegates to a secession convention in Austin decide that, secession's going to happen and the referendum is held, San Antonio does not go pro-secession. There's actually a pretty good degree of voter manipulation and intimidation in that election, in that referendum. And still San Antonians are going, I don't know, man, this is sort of like killing the golden goose, or the goose that lays the golden egg, better metaphor. They're not all for it. And so the guys in the Menger say, well, guess what? We're going to make you for it. And we're going to start really intimidating folks and resorting to not only political intimidation, but sometimes outright violence. The state authorities declare that once Texas is seceded, that all the federal authorities had to be removed from Texas. David Twiggs was the commander of this particular part of the U.S. Army down here in charge of this vast region in West Texas and beyond. And he's told, hey, all right, we've seceded. We're no longer part of the Union. And you can just imagine him sitting in his desk going, well, what's that mean? Exactly what do you mean you've seceded? And, okay, what's that mean for me? Now, David Twiggs is a Georgian, and Georgia has already seceded as well, so I guess I will go with my state. It's interesting, the United States in 1860 had a real sense of local political affiliation. If you would put that into a Mexican context or a Spanish colonial context, that would have been La Patria Chica, the small patriotism. You're loyal to your family, you're loyal to your neighborhood, you're loyal to your state. The federal government, the sense of nationhood was way down the list. So Twiggs said, if Georgia goes, I go. Georgia went, so he went, and he surrendered everything under his authority.
Yeah, the Civil War officially begins on April 12th, 1861 at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. But because General Twiggs surrendered at the Alamo on February 16th, 1861, if he hadn't, the first shots of the Civil War could have been fired at the Alamo. It could have changed history as we knew it.
Could have been fired at the Alamo if he had not gone peacefully. And it's interesting, there's actually an incident out at Fort Chadbourne, because Chadbourne's at the far end of the supply line, far end of the communication chain. And the commander at Fort Chadbourne hadn't gotten the word. And then all of a sudden, these Texas troops showed up and said, hey, we're here to take over your fort. They said, well, if you want to come and take it, Where have we heard that before? And so they're squaring up for a battle at Fort Chadbourne, which is a really unlikely place to have a Civil War event. So they both decide, all right, we're going to send a galloper into San Antonio, and we're going to hear from headquarters. And sure enough, the courier returned and said, no, you're right. Everybody's out. So they threw the keys over the fence and marched out of Fort Chadbourne. So there's a lot of different flashpoints where this could have occurred. The fact that San Antonio was so divided, and the fact that there's about 1,000, maybe 1,100 people that converge on San Antonio and outnumber the local garrison significantly, that this secession event occurs largely without incident. A lot of posturing, a lot of puffing, a lot of menacing talk,
but no gunshots.
But no gunshots. Nobody opens fire. Nobody fires that first shot, that first salvo. The federal troops just pack up and they head over to Indianola to catch a boat for the East Coast.
On the second floor of the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, there is a large flag on display that says Alamo City Guards. What's the story behind that flag?
All right, so the Alamo City Guards are a local militia unit. They drill, they train for whatever crisis might come up, and they are really instrumental in providing some of the muscle, or at least the intimidation, behind that secession activity. So if you're going to secede and make it stick, somebody's got to make it stick, and usually that involves people with guns. And the Alamo City Guards are sort of part of a matrix of different volunteer groups down here, but they're the ones that at least get a flag made, and they know how to stand in straight lines and march to the right and march to the left. They also have some people that can train them on how to use artillery. And the Alamo City Guards pretty quickly becomes an artillery unit. And they're using guns, or cannon, that have been taken from the arsenal and from the holdings at the Alamo, essentially part of the garrison here. These are all probably Model 1841 6-pounders, so it's Army surplus, not exactly state-of-the-art by 1860, but nothing in the U.S. Army is state-of-the-art because we didn't spend a lot of money on our Army. But the Alamo City Guards ultimately becomes Edgar's Battery. And Edgar's Battery will end up having a long Civil War career in the Trans-Mississippi. But their origins are right there. Well, their flag is right there on the second floor, and their origins are within blocks of the Alamo.
There were some early skirmishes and incidents in San Antonio during those first few months of the Civil War. What were they? When
you surrender and then take over a large military department like is happening in Texas, it takes a while to get that accomplished. So about 1 in 4 of all U.S. troops at that time were in Texas. So Texas is a big deal when it comes to the military.
Really, the origins of Military City, USA, which San Antonio is known as today, is back then.
Oh, yeah, way back then. I mean, as soon as Texas is annexed to the U.S. Army shows up and everybody goes, yay, there's jobs. Getting word out to everybody takes time. And what is not standing still is time. What looked like it was going to be a peaceful exchange of property in late February and all through March ends up taking on a high degree of intensity after the firing on Fort Sumter. After the firing on Fort Sumter, everybody declares, oh, is this what we're going to do? All right, we're not just going to shake hands and say, well, you go your way, I'll go my way. No, we're actually going to try to kill each other, and that changes everybody's attitude. Already we've talked about the forts being taken over one by one, but there's some forts way out west. I'm thinking places like Fort Hancock and Fort Bliss and Fort Davis out there in the Trans-Pecos, that it just takes some time to get all their gear together, lock up the buildings, leave the keys under the doormat, and start moving towards Indianola. And as a result, they're still on their way in when events take a sudden turn there in South Carolina. So all of these state troops that had gathered to effect the takeover of the Department of Texas then decide they're going to square up with these guys coming in and declare that they are now prisoners of war. They're not actually part of any sort of accord. that lets them go to the coast. Now they're armed belligerents in the middle of a seceded state. So there is actually a showdown over west of town in which these Texas troops show up and say, all right, guess what we have? We have artillery, and we have about 5 times as many guys as you do. So if you guys want to make a fight of it, we can make a fight of it. And instead, the commander says, I don't think we got a fight in us today. And so that very volatile situation diffuses as well.
This became known as the Battle of Adams Hill. Modern day, it was on Highway 90, a little bit past Loop 1604, so far west Bexar County, modern day. Then on May 19th, the San Antonio Express newspaper office was burned. That's not far from the Alamo, that original building.
That's right. And so now that you have any vestige of federal authority tamped down, essentially cut off at the roots, then you can start going around town and settling old scores. And yes, that newspaper in downtown San Antonio had been a very loud unionist voice. And then one day, bad things happened to it. The offices catch fire, and the editor's told, this is a mighty dangerous neighborhood for people like you. And same thing happened to Charles Anderson over what is now the Argyle Club. I mean, he was the brother to Robert Anderson that was the defender of Fort Sumter. But he'd come to Bexar County to be a rancher, and that was his ranch headquarters. And then all of a sudden, people start showing up saying, hey, we heard what your brother did, and guess what? There's new rules in town, and you are on the wrong side of them. And so he has to leave the territory too. I mean, if you're pro-union, all of a sudden you're looking for a place to hide or looking for some sort of safe haven.
How are Confederate forces using the Alamo during the Civil War? Okay,
so the Alamo comes with a very nice dowry of weapons. Now, these, again, state of the art is kind of a slippery sort of definition. This is mostly stuff that had been cached there from the various campaigns, especially from the U.S.-Mexican War. So it's got a bunch of stuff that's nearly good, nearly new, maybe slightly used. And so that becomes the arsenal that equips the first state forces that assemble in San Antonio, enter into Confederate service, and then go on their campaigns further afield.
So but all that stock of supplies inside the church in Lauenberg are now Confederate.
That's right. And not only there, but also at the Arsenal, which is down on the south side of downtown, which is the HEB headquarters today. There is the apparatus and machinery for supplying several thousand troops, because they had been in the supplying several thousand troops business for about a decade and a half by that point. So all of this equipment, all of this know-how, all of this functionality ends up becoming Confederate. Now, what happens to all the U.S. troops that are here? Some of them make it to Indianola and go on their way. Some have some decisions to make. I mean, one of the U.S. troops that has the decision to make during all this volatile time is Robert E. Lee. He was actually coming into San Antonio when the takeover of the Alamo happened. So there's some divided loyalties. The dust kind of settles by the summer of 61, and all of these functions now are Confederate functions, and they expand on them. There's a gunpowder mill that is built in San Antonio. There's a tan yard over that's what is now Brackenridge Park. So it becomes a Confederate supply hub.
We've talked on a previous episode of the podcast about the U.S. Army's Great Camel Experiment, using camels to explore the American West. The camels that worked here at the Alamo were from Camp Verde, pretty close to where you live in Kerrville.
Yeah.
How was Camp Verde used in the Civil War?
It's an interesting place because it was the headquarters for the U.S. Camel Experiment. And the Secretary of War that launched that experiment was Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. And so later on, he has a different, job title during the Civil War. The camels are kept up at Verde, and they have all sorts of trials and experiments with them. They take them all the way to the West Coast. They race a cavalry unit. They decide that, camels might actually work, but they also use them to freight to and from San Antonio to Camp Verde and elsewhere. So it's a very exotic and interesting little enclave up there in right on the line between Bandera and Kerr counties. And when secession occurs, state troops roll in there and say, all right, it's our fort now. And they say, great, but you have to take the camels too, because they're pretty disagreeable. And so the Confederates all of a sudden had a bunch of camels, and they didn't know what to do with them. So by and large, just left the gate open and let them populate out into the hill country. Later on, the camels will end up being captured and used to freight goods back and forth. They say that the last feral camel in Texas was killed in the 1870s. You know, you got some sodbuster out there and sees a really funny looking horse. I'm just going to shoot that spitting thing. But Camp Verde ends up having a dual purpose because remember those federal troops that are trying to get out of Texas that get hauled up short west of town, they've got to go somewhere. At first, they put them over towards the San Pedro Springs. They move them around the greater San Antonio area, but they decided, that's pretty inconvenient, and they house them up at Camp Verde. We talked about that little brush up west of town, and those U.S. troops are not treated as parolees, they're not allowed to continue their journey. They're kept essentially as a bargaining chip because nobody knows exactly how this sort of confrontation is going to play out. So they're housed up at San Pedro Springs. They're moved over to the Salado Creek area. But finally, after it looks like we're going to be in a serious shooting war, they decide, no, we don't need these guys right here in town, especially with, all sorts of closet unionists hanging around. So they move them up to Camp Verde. There's a pretty significant box canyon up there that is still to this day known as Prisoner Canyon, where they put them all. And they just kind of watched the mouth of the canyon and said, hey, if you guys want to climb those cliffs, get after it. Most of the prisoners were content to stay right there. But there's another element up in the hill country, and those guys are known as free thinkers. These are Germans that have immigrated to the hill country after the revolutions in Europe of 1848. And several of them have decided to set up communities of like-minded folks, especially places like Comfort and Sisterdale, that region. Also in southern Gillespie County, around places like Lukenbach. And so these guys are declaring themselves pro-union, but not interested in any trouble. Well, if you're not interested in any trouble, you don't call yourself the Union Loyal League, which is what they call themselves. And the folks in Lukenbach called themselves the Lukenbach Bushwhackers. So if you're a Confederate authority and you're trying to put the thumb on everybody, these guys are kind of thumbing their nose at you. So the Confederate authorities are trying to figure out, how do we break the back of this unionist enclave? They're not violent, they're not threatening, but who knows when they may go active. Then the Confederate authorities catch wind that they're thinking of springing all those U.S. prisoners out of Prisoner Canyon and creating an insurrection, a pro-union insurrection in this rear area of the Confederacy, essentially the Texas Hill Country, and threaten San Antonio. Confederate authorities move up there, and they establish a series of provost, marshal outposts where nobody can move in Kerr County, Gillespie County, Blanco County, Kendall County without a pass. So they declare martial law. Then they say, oh, guess what? Confederate conscription is now the law of the land. We don't have enough enthusiastic recruits to make this great temper tantrum we're throwing stick. So we're now going to make it the law of the land that if you're between the ages of, say, 18 and 30 some odd, you have to join the Confederate military. Few exceptions. That means all you Germans and all your military-aged young men that are waving that American flag everywhere, y'all are now subject to conscription. And by the way, don't get any fast ideas about these Union prisoners over at Camp Verde. So the Germans up in the hill country figure out, well, we'd probably better serve our own interest and that of our adopted country by fleeing to Mexico. So they all light out towards Mexico, but they're well armed and well equipped heading to Mexico. Confederate authorities, which had come from San Antonio up to places like Gillespie County, catch wind of what's going on and they intercept them. Now, not too far, a few miles south of what is Kickapoo Cavern State Park on the upper Nueces. And there's a knockdown, drag-out fight in August of 1862 that leaves about 30 of those Germans dead. It leaves about 20 of the Confederates dead or wounded too. And I can tell you that the Western Hill Country in 1862 is a bad place to be wounded because I don't think
there wasn't much out there.
Yeah, they're not going to care flight you. That ends up kind of putting the squash on those Unionists up in the hill country, but Camp Verde is central to all that.
Our conversation continues after this message.
This is Charlie Crockett, Texas musician and descendant of Davy Crockett, inviting you to visit the Alamo. It's not the same Alamo you, remember. There's lots of new things to experience, like the 500 artifacts inside the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, the new Mission Gate and Lunette outdoor exhibit, and Surrounded, the Alamo Augmented Experience. It's all part of an ongoing restoration and expansion that will write the Alamo's next chapter. So don't wait. Plan your visit today at thealamo.org.
Welcome back to the Alamo podcast. There were some Civil War campaigns that originated in San Antonio. Tell us about those campaigns and how the Alamo played a role in them.
The Alamo is the iconic structure. I mean, it doesn't matter how soon after the battle ended, people understood that something remarkable had happened there. Even when Frederick Law Olmsted came through San Antonio in, I think it was 1853, he wanted to go see the Alamo. And he says, this is not a shrine to a religious sort of impulse. This is a shrine to courage. So even a guy from New York City that's down here talking smack about everything in the South, when he comes and sees the Alamo, I mean, he takes his hat off and puts it over his heart and says, wow, this is a pretty profound place. So if you're trying to get some of that military sort of juice in your troops, you want to parade them, you want to assemble them in front of the Alamo. There's two expeditions almost immediately in the summer of 61, fall of 61, that leave from Alamo Plaza. One is an expedition under the command of John Robert Baylor. And John Robert Baylor takes a few hundred men, and his idea is to go and occupy the forts, the far-flung forts like Fort Lancaster and Fort Davis and all the way out to Fort Bliss. And then he'll move into southern New Mexico territory and kind of put the Confederate stamp on it if he can. So he goes out in the fall of 61. Meanwhile, another expedition is being outfitted that's led by Henry Hopkins Sibley. So Sibley's going to go and build upon anything that John Robert Baylor is able to accomplish. Sibley'd gone all the way to Richmond, gotten permission from the Confederate government, came back, said, all right, I'm going to lead largely a Texas army out into New Mexico and take over that territory, then maybe head up to Colorado and then head west through Utah. The Mormons are notoriously angry at the federal government. We'll drag those guys into the fold. Then we'll head out to California as well. Now, if you think about the Civil War as being a great divorce, well, who gets the community property? Well, the community property in this instance is all that territory out west. So the Confederates are saying, hey, we've got as much claim to this as the federal government does. So in order to make that stick, they got to send troops. And that's what Sibley does, is he essentially starts amassing a brigade here. And this will be a mounted brigade of 3 regiments. It'll be the 4th and 5th and 7th Texas Cavalries. So you got to start bringing in horses. You got to bring in fodder, and you got to bring in equipment. And so it's an assembly point as well during the fall of 61. This also brings all sorts of newcomers to town. We're talking about better part of 2,000 young men with all sorts of young men sort of habits. And they're knocking over the stands in the Civic Plaza. They're being rowdy at the local bars. They're doing stupid stuff. Finally, one of them just crosses the line so much that he gets hanged over on the Civic Plaza. They say, there's even a limit to how much ruffianism we can tolerate. Eventually, though, Sibley's guys all assembled out there, essentially where Fort Sam Houston is now, out on Salado Creek as well. He says, all right, y'all come to the Alamo. I'm going to give you a stirring speech, and we're going to go invade New Mexico. And that's what happened.
We talked about the need for troops, and so they conscripted people into the Army. What about the need for supplies? I also understand that wool was warehoused in San Antonio to exchange for supplies needed by the Confederacy.
You bet. Those guys are all wearing itchy uniforms, and so wool becomes pretty critical. So there's wool warehouses here. They're also marching on leather shoes, and the tan yard is out here as well. So it becomes a pretty important quartermaster depot, and quartermaster's in charge of getting all those supplies in the hands of the troops. But it also is a pretty good ordnance depot as well, with the powder works that are just east of town, probably around where the Alamo Dome is now, actually. It's an important hub, and it remains an important hub. There are other units that are raised in this area. The one that I'm most interested in is the 3rd Texas Infantry, is raised out of San Antonio and headquartered in San Antonio. What's interesting about this unit, it is made up of very reluctant Rebs. They give orders in 3 languages, so English, Spanish, and German, because it's made of essentially, it looks like San Antonio. And so they all assemble here in San Antonio. They are outfitted here. There's other units that are raised in San Antonio as well. One that becomes the 33rd Texas Cavalry, for instance. Those were the guys in previous iteration busted up the Germans. So there's kind of a rough and rowdy Confederate element, and then there's kind of a reluctant Confederate element all in the same town. And, there's bound to have been some side eyes and, sort of posturing and shoving on the sidewalks between all these guys. But that's kind of the way San Antonio runs. But it's never really threatened as a Confederate military post. That is until the summer of 1863.
That leads into my next question. Was there ever a threat the Union could invade Texas, specifically San Antonio?
You bet. In the course of the American Civil War, there's only two state capitals that are never occupied, southern state capitals, Tallahassee, Florida, and Austin, Texas. It's not because they didn't try, both times, they just didn't pull it off. But in the fall of 1863, Union forces have really started to dominate the battlefield. Gettysburg is over. Vicksburg is over. The Trans-Mississippi is cut off. And Abraham Lincoln sends word to his generals on the Mississippi, go ahead and roll up the Trans-Mississippi. Roll up Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, primarily because he needed those electoral college votes for his next election, and he also needed those states to be readmitted into the Union as quickly as possible to help him get a 13th Amendment passed. So there's some very political moves going on in which they're trying to create a scaffolding in Washington that'll make sure that slavery never returns. And the only way to do that is to get a constitutional amendment saying that particular species of property can no longer be tolerated within the American Union. But that takes time. You got to get that scaffolding done, and that means troops on the ground. So the big plan is, all right, we're going to invade Texas. Well, they try in September of 1863, and they're turned back at Sabine Pass. Then there's a battle in Georgia, Chickamauga, which draws troops away from the Trans-Mississippi and the Mississippi River Valley, leaving just a remnant to take on this very big chore. But Nathaniel P. Banks is pretty game for it, so he decides, well, we'll plant the flag in Texas, and we'll plant it in Brownsville. All right, so he invades Texas via Brownsville, but he starts moving up the coast. Well, a lot of people don't realize that there's also Union troops in El Paso that get all the way to the Pecos River, and they've come from California, and they got as far as Fort Lancaster. So when the Union troops are landing in Brownsville and they're moving up to Matagorda Bay, they start exchanging notes. And they send riders all the way out to Lancaster saying, hey, you guys push east, we'll push west, we'll meet in San Antonio. Well, this is not rocket science. I mean, you can take a look at the map and say, wait, there's a bunch over here and a bunch over here, and what's the creamy middle of this sandwich? Oh, that's San Antonio. And so locals start digging in, and they build fortifications. I mean, they dig earthworks around downtown San Antonio, thinking that sooner or later there's going to be a showdown right here in the Alamo City. It might have been another Battle of the Alamo, one never knows. But neither the troops at Lancaster nor the troops at Matagorda Bay had the stroke to do it. And so the threat passes.
Let's revisit a key figure of the Texas Revolution,
Sure.
Sam Houston. At the start of the Civil War, he is forced out of being the state's governor because he was opposed to leaving the Union. He passes away in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, and his funeral is not very well attended.
It's not. It's interesting when people outlive their time on stage. And Sam Houston had kind of been overcome by events. This is a guy who saw the Texas Project as kind of being part of his identity. And when he is asked to take an oath of loyalty to the Confederate government, he just refuses to do it. And the new secessionist authorities, whether they're legitimate or not, depends on your opinion, they declare that the office of governor is vacant. They elevate the lieutenant governor into that position. And Sam Houston goes back to Galveston into his home further east to lick his wounds. This great experiment that he had spent his entire life, his blood and treasure in pursuing, has now just fallen upon this wave of what he considered just lunacy. He leaves public life and is just being an observer. But his son joins the Confederate Army. Says, Dad, sorry, you're missing the boat on this one. I'm in. And Sam Houston's going, I'm going to tell you it's going to end as a disaster. And sure enough, Sam Houston Jr. is wounded at the Battle of Shiloh and taken prisoner and then exchanged. And he comes back, and his dad's aging and, kind of in failing health. And his son says, I will never go back in the Confederate Army. I've learned my lesson. Here, Dad, let me make you some tea. And then Sam Houston dies. And then Sam Houston Jr. goes back into the Confederate Army. So as soon as his dad was off the scene, he kind of went back on his promise. What's interesting about Sam Houston is in his final days, there's some question over whether or not he was still a staunch Unionist. And here's why. It's easy to be a Unionist in 1861 if your vision of the Union is an 1850s, 1840s vision of the Union. But by 1863, you're looking at federal authority that is going in and violating, pick an amendment to the Constitution, pick a Bill of Rights. They are absolutely using a very heavy hand across the American South. And they are seizing property, they're destroying things, they're killing people. And this is not what Sam Houston thought the function of the federal government ought to be.
But we're in the middle of a war.
We are in the middle of a war, but it's a strange kind of war. You're having to now extract this relationship of the federal government to the states and watch what would happen had the federal government been unfettered. An unchecked federal government, as it played out by 1863, enforces law at the point of a bayonet. There is no due process. And if you don't do what the federals tell you to do, you're going to lose your property. They may put a torch to it. They may just seize it. There's going to be a major, major catastrophe. When we talk about property, we tend to tap dance around the idea that slaves are considered property, enslaved people. So we're talking about property and human beings, which is creepy to think about today. But if you think about human beings as property, then that means that they're falling on everybody's balance sheet. This is not an income and expense. This is not just sheer labor. This is actual property that has title. You can take out a mortgage on them. And what the federal government is saying that they're intent on doing after the 1st of January, 1863, is eliminating an entire category of private property to the tune of about, $24 trillion in today's value. And so even somebody like Sam Houston is saying, I'm all for the Union as I thought about it, but this new Union is kind of scary. And there's some question that by the time he died, he started rethinking, some of his earlier held beliefs, because as the war cranked up, as you said, hey, it's time of war.
So that gives us a taste of what daily life would have been like for just the average person living in San Antonio, living around the Alamo.
San Antonio is so far insulated from all of the badness further east that you'd only caught glimpses or whiffs of it, hints and rumors. For instance, the New Mexico campaign fails miserably, but they had already formed a state government or a territorial government. So what do you do if you're the territorial governor of Confederate Arizona, which doesn't really exist? Well, you go to San Antonio and you take up residence in one of the local saloons and you play a lot of cards and wait for a better day coming, which never comes. So you have this interesting government in exile from the Confederate territories. You have people that are freighting goods from Mexico in and out of San Antonio. You've got guys that are bringing goods into San Antonio to warehouse for redistribution elsewhere. And so it's kind of a booming time in San Antonio. It's kind of good to be in San Antonio during the Civil War because there's a lot of activity that can make you some money. And you're never really threatened militarily. The secessionists are in charge. You just kind of roll with the new regime. But there's also a booming market in cotton after the summer of 1863, and also cattle. And so people start leaning into those, two major staples of the Texas economy, and San Antonio becomes a shipping point for both. People are rounding up cattle, people are gathering cotton, and what they're doing is they're running it right down the road to Laredo, and they're also running it right down the road all the way to Brownsville. And so this is actually known as the time of the high cotton. This is a really booming time period, talking about 64 into 65. And you can be in San Antonio and the war is a long way away, but all of a sudden you're kind of prospering in ways that you had not anticipated.
The Civil War ends in 1865, and the Alamo returns to the U.S. Army. Now, that is a really easy sentence to say, but the reality of that, not so simple.
Yeah, and what happens when you have a would-be nation collapse? What happens to all the stuff that would-be government had accumulated? Well, people in San Antonio understand, this war's over. We're going to knock the locks off the government warehouses, in this case, the Confederate government warehouses, and they loot and plunder everything. They just say, well, there is no government that owns this stuff anymore, so it might as well be mine. And while they're at it, there's a couple of dry goods stores and some private enterprises. They loot those as well. So there's kind of this spate of looting that goes on. People all kind of go their separate ways, and then the federal authority returns, and they set up shop at the Menger Hotel. And they say, all right, this is a pretty good headquarters, pretty centrally located, and they start trying to reassert federal authority. At first, it's General Wesley Merritt that brings in some Illinois cavalrymen, and they're looking around and going, man, this is the most exotic place we've ever seen. And then his commander, Philip Sheridan, shows up to finally put the stamp on it in August of 1865 and reassert federal authority. And it's supposed to be during this trip into San Antonio where he is credited with making the following quip. He said, as he's looking around, heading into San Antonio in August, he says, if I owned hell and I owned Texas, I would live in hell and rent out Texas. So clearly he was in San Antonio in August. But that's how the federal authority is reasserted, but they don't really take over the line of forts for another year and a half, and it's a process.
Not too far from San Antonio is Galveston,
Yes.
where June 19th, 1865, now known as Juneteenth, a very important day. Why did it take so long for the news of emancipation to reach the far corners of Texas?
Because Texas is big, and the Federals never really control it. So June 19th, 1865, is the second Declaration of Independence in many ways. And what happens is Gordon Granger shows up in Galveston. They're got a federal garrison reestablished in Galveston, making sure everybody's playing by the rules. Galveston and San Antonio have a lot of things in common, actually. It's a very mixed population, strong unionist sentiment. They're all going, all right, good. Now we've got the good guys are back and we can get on with things. And Gordon Granger's looking around going, well, there's a very large African-American, freedman population here that hasn't quite got the word. And so they just read the orders. Hey, you guys are all free. In case nobody's let you in on this, y'all are all free. What's remarkable is word doesn't finally trickle into the deepest recesses of East Texas for another decade. There are people that are still working farms in East Texas that have to be told by the county sheriff in the 1870s, hey, what are you guys doing here? Well, this guy is my master. You have no master. It was a long process. Juneteenth is pointed to as a watershed event, and it is, but it's not the final word on it. I mean, it just is a long trickle-out process. And some would argue, that begins a process that still remains incomplete to this day on how do you integrate that enslaved population into the mainstream of the American experience. And that's certainly a story that I know we're going to be telling at the Alamo.
Well, when you think about it, the Republic of Texas lasted more than twice as long as the Confederacy. But the impact of the Civil War absolutely cannot be understated. What is your takeaway from your decades of research on how it impacted San Antonio and particularly the Alamo?
The Civil War is the event in defining who we are as a country, and that relationship between the federal government and the states. What does American federalism look like? Is it like a layer cake? Is it some sort of blend, kind of a marbled cake? Exactly what kind of cake have we baked here in the United States? And that is still open to debate. Exactly what American federalism looks like. And some people want it to be a little more federal centered, and some like a little more state control. Texas, after the Civil War, becomes in many ways the Confederacy in concentrate. So it has a huge growth boom that happens after the Civil War. A bunch of this new immigration is from the defeated South. And these people tote with them in their, skull bones, their same sort of attitudes and their same sort of proclivities. And Texas, by 1876, is very clearly a 10th Amendment state. And that means, we're going to be very jealous of all of our state prerogatives, and we're going to push back against the federal government whenever we can, whenever we think there's an overreach. They are not ready to call it quits on the larger questions that were being debated during the American Civil War. So San Antonio and the Alamo all of a sudden look around and they're in a brand new age. And it's a whole different place in the 1850s. And there's new immigration coming in, and the nature of the place is shifting. And the military shows up and says, who in the world thought we would be able to use just the Alamo and the arsenal and a couple of warehouses to equip what we need equipped? They are now an industrial military, and they need an industrial military facility. And that ultimately leads to Fort Sam Houston and the abandonment of all the other trappings of the military in San Antonio in favor of that new post. And so the Alamo ends up becoming kind of derelict. You know, it's kind of a place it used to be, a place that had been. And sure, you still kind of, take your hat off when you go by, but hey, the 1860s, late 60s, into the 70s, and certainly into the 80s, San Antonio is all about commerce, and it is absolutely growing, and the money is flowing in, and people are looking towards the future, not towards the past. And the Alamo is just kind of an echo of the past. And so it kind of starts taking a much more subdued role. Sure, people go by, they look at it and they think about those days. There's demonstrations of, new farming techniques or new equipment. There's, one rumor that they first demonstrated barbed wire right there on Alamo Plaza, but it's no longer front and center. As a result, the town just grows all over it. And the Alamo's sort of like, well, who put that, junky relic over there behind this really cool, grocery store? It faces a very uncertain future until all the way to the end of the 19th century. And then the women of Texas rally, and they saved the place.
Dr. Don Frazier, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We have linked to more on Dr. Frazier and his books about Texas and the Civil War. We've also linked to an essay about this time period written by the Alamo's former curator, Dr. Bruce Winders. The Alamo podcast will be taking a break next week as we celebrate 4th of July. But don't forget to join us in person if you can next Friday, July 4th, for the Stars and Stripes Salute concert on Plaza de Valero. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo podcast.